Welcome to the Geneva Graduate Institute Events Rewind, your passport to global discourse from the heart of international Geneva. Brought to you by the Geneva Graduate Institute. Join us for insightful event recordings covering diverse subjects from around the world. Experience captivating discussions and insights from professors, thought leaders, experts, and visionaries from around the globe. This is the Geneva Graduate Institute Events Rewind, where diverse perspectives converge for meaningful exchange.
Cher Olivier, chère Béatrice, cher Pascal, que je ne vois plus mais qui est là-bas, cher Hakim, mesdames et messieurs, chers collègues, mesdames et messieurs en vos titres et fonctions, chers collègues, chers étudiants, chers amis, bonne soirée, bienvenue à l'Institut et à la Maison de la Paix. I'm really delighted to welcome you tonight for the launch of the second edition of the Geneva Policy Outlook, GPO 2024 as we call it. The Geneva Policy Outlook is an initiative with three main objectives: to generate critical debate and systemic perspective by nurturing and animating a diverse community, first. Second, to connect science and academic debates with the concrete and multiple challenges of our radically uncertain and dangerous world. Third, to produce actionable and forward-looking insights that can inform the types of courageous decisions that our world and its challenges badly need. Let me underscore here how this project is aligned with the vision and the mission of the Institute as put forward in our newly reformulated charter, and I'll quote the charter here. The Geneva Graduate Institute is a pioneer in the exploration of global issues. It opens creative spaces for diverse communities and fosters the understanding and the engagement essential to a peaceful, equitable, and sustainable world. Hence, the Geneva Policy Outlook is an important and very meaningful initiative for us that contributes to materializing our vision and our mission. As you well know, the Geneva Policy Outlook has been from the start a collaborative project. Hence, I would like to express today a number of thanks. First, I would like to thank our funding partner organizations, the Republic and State of Geneva, the City of Geneva, and the Fondation pour Genève. All three have believed in the project from the start, and they have invested together with us in order to make that project a reality. It's important to underscore that our funding partners have also been very active contributors in the process and in the many discussions that have taken place along the years leading up to the production of the final object, GPO 2024, which exists in an online version, but also in print, and this year in 3 languages, both online and in print. And you've certainly all got a copy. If not, please take a copy when you go out. Let me also turn to the community that has crystallized over the last 2 years around the Geneva Policy Outlook. I would like to thank all of you. I see many of you here today in the room. I'm impressed by the quality, the depth, and the breadth of our discussions. I've learned personally a lot, and I feel that we've been able to go quite far in building up what is needed today, a community of learning that is able to produce new insights, propositions, and steps towards solutions by bringing together diverse and complementary expertise. Within that broad community of learning, let me give particular thanks to the contributors for this year's edition, and I'm delighted that we will be listening to some of them in a minute as they present their contributions. Internally at the Institute, let me also express my most sincere thanks to Hakim Venman, the soul of the project, and to Lena Menge for all the work and the energy that they have put and are still putting into the Geneva Policy Outlook. Let me add here my thanks to the excellent team that has been involved at the different stages of the process, Gabrielle Gomez-Couto, Sveta Ramachandran, Dr. Xeniu Yon, Melis Gluck, and Fabian Hoffman, who have worked above and beyond the call of duty. I've read this new edition of the Geneva Policy Outlook from page 1 to 118 in the English version. The other versions are longer, French and German are. And I've read it with both great interest and great pleasure. Great interest because all themes in that edition are talking to key issues and challenges of our world, from the fragility of diplomacy to the rising up of new actors and dynamics of multilateralism, from the centrality of the technological and environmental transitions and their impact on all multilateral organizations and processes, to the new or returning wars and the threats that they represent for what we do in Geneva, peace and the work of peace, human rights and humanitarianism in particular. And all along this edition, a key question comes back, page after page. What does all this imply for Geneva? How will Geneva remain relevant in the context of such profound transformation? Beyond the depth and the relevance of the content, I would also like to say how reading this edition has been a pleasure. The contributions are written in a way that makes complex issues accessible to all, and each contribution gives an expert overview that is at the same time useful when you work on the issue, but also enlightening when you approach the issue from a non-expert perspective. I underscored last year at the launch of the first edition that I had a dream, and I feel that with that second edition we are getting closer to that dream. We have today in Geneva an exceptional opportunity. In fact, opportunity is not the right word. Duty is more like it. We have the duty to make use of the unique density of experience, expertise, and knowledge that is present here around us, and to come together and actively shape the debate on the future that we want. When the noises around us are screaming war, we need to keep affirming and preparing for peace. When the zeitgeist is one of separation, of re-enclosing and conflict, we need to activate collaboration and cooperation and demonstrate its power. When the solutions of yesterday have shown their limits, if they are not in fact part of the problem, we have to be creative, and creativity cannot happen without the existence of spaces and times for exploration, without active listening and co-learning. When uncertainty, fear, if not despair, impose themselves, we have to regain and to retrain our individual and collective courage. Geneva is the right place where these flames can be nurtured. Peace, collaboration, realist utopia, courage, integrity. All this, after all, makes up the spirit of Geneva, and the urgency of declining it for the particular challenges of our world is now, to borrow the words of Martin Luther King. We need scientifically informed and solutions-oriented readings of our world, infused by a positive and not a dystopic vision of our future. A future where the well-being of humans and humus, the planet and biodiversity on which we humans are dependent and on which we thrive, are reaffirmed as priorities. A future where we project once again the fight for peace and human rights. And maybe peace should become a human right, as Professor Andrew Clapham proposes in his contribution. A future where we take seriously Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that all human beings are born equal in dignity and rights. We just simply cannot give up on our future. We cannot accept the probable future that the zeitgeist seems to project. We have to foster the energy to build instead a desirable future, the one that we owe to our children and to our grandchildren. And here I'm convinced that Geneva has a particular role and mission, a responsibility. We should think here not only of the physical dimension of the location, Geneva as a place, but also of the symbolic resource that is associated with Geneva. We have the duty to pool our energies, our experience, our knowledge, our expertise, to propose grounded but nevertheless utopian readings and solutions in order to activate and to prepare the future we want beyond the black clouds of our present. It is in exceptional periods that everything becomes possible, as Jean Monnet said when building up Europe, just after the end of the most horrendous war humanity had imposed on itself. And our current period is indeed, again and very sadly, exceptional also in that sense. I believe that the Geneva Policy Outlook in one form or another can and should be an important mechanism allowing us to go in that direction, carrying the voice of Geneva for the world and with the world, a voice that should reaffirm its own tone in spite, if not because, of the current violent and dissonant chorus. This is my dream, this year as last year, and it has just become more urgent than last year. Let me wish you all a great evening, and I now leave the floor to Hakim Venman, who will be presenting the rest of this evening. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Also from my part, as the editor of the Geneva Policy Outlook, I'm really pleased to have reached this moment again. Because as Marie-Laure emphasized, the moment is now to think about how Geneva stays relevant as a global hub. We started this endeavor and this journey about 2 years ago, when we as a Graduate Institute received many calls and many inquiries of, can you help us understand what's going on? Because the world is changing so fast. And so 2 years on, we have now the second edition of the Geneva Policy Outlook with a number of voices from a community that really cares about this very global space, that really cares about the world and exactly wants to swim against the zeitgeist of war and insustainability. So I would already like to thank all of those in the Geneva Policy Outlook who have been part of the journey. We have currently a group of about 150 professionals that are part of the broader group. And what for me stands out is that they are a group that demonstrates a tremendous can-do attitude. So there are many people in Geneva, which is another attitude, I think, for what Marie-Laure spoke about, is who will not take the realities as they are for a fact, but they understand that we have to collaborate and work together in order to change. Because what we see is not really acceptable, and we need to go against the zeitgeist and present a better future, develop a better future together. Now, the other result that we have achieved, I think, beyond the very paper which you have in front of you, is something which in academia we call a Denkkollektiv. As the GPO also exists in German, I think it's very good to put in a German word once in a while. It's really a group of professionals that want to think together. Because if there is one thing that is clear, just one institution, one actor, or even one individual head does not have all the answers. And so I think this comes out very nicely in the current distribution of voices that you find in the Geneva Policy Outlook, where you have, in fact, these voices that represent a cross-cutting identity of how we can find solution in this very town. Now, I'd like to invite the first round of speakers on stage, because you don't want to hear from me, you want to hear from the authors. So I invite Jamil, Roxana, and Marie-Laure to come up. And while they're coming up, I'll invite all of you to do something that I very rarely tell my son, who's also here in the audience. Can you take out your mobile phones and just click on the website, genevapolicyoutlook.ch. And just as you speak, you can, in fact, have a look at the article. You can also click on the article you most like. Not only we want this to improve our statistics, but we also want you to discover the diversity of views which are out there. So this is perhaps one of the only events in Geneva where you can have your mobile in your hand as the event is going on, because I know that you will be watching the Geneva Policy Outlook website. So, ladies and gentlemen, enough from me. My thanks to everyone who was involved, particularly to a fantastic team, and of course all the authors and all those who followed us through various dinners, lunches, and breakfast meetings. So this brings us now to Ask Jamil, and the first conversation about your art. And let me just see if this is on. Yes, this is on. Jamil, you're an award-winning journalist from Brazil. You have also a fantastic distinction that you're an alumni of the Graduate Institute. That's what I have. And so you are in a very envious position many times that you have access to many spaces that many other individuals don't have access to, because you're an investigative journalist and you speak to a lot of people. So when you attended the BRICS negotiations on the enlargement, what did you see? What did you experience in South Africa?
Akim, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for this initiative. Thank you to Graduate Institute for taking this reflection or having this reflection. And I'll come to your question, and I promise I'm going to answer it. Yes, I will.
Usually it's the other way around,
no.
that you ask the questions.
I know. That's why I'm not that used to it. But the fact is that when I read the title of this debate, I thought, it's not only how will Geneva stay relevant, it is how multilateralism stay relevant. Now, Geneva can only stay relevant if it recognizes the obvious. And what is the obvious? It's the profound change in power structure in the world. That is what I saw in South Africa. That is what I see every day when I write. And that is at least my reality, even here in Geneva. So if Geneva does not reflect these changes, I'm very sorry to say, but it will be ignored. And I'm not exaggerating here, because the world will not wait. 5 or 6 billion people in the world will not wait. Actually, they are not waiting. So we can have a discussion about this a bit later, but certainly one of the most fundamental expression of this power structural change is the BRICS and the enlargement. But before I say something here, let me be very clear. I do not represent the Brazilian government. The Brazilian government knows that very well. I'm not a champion of the enlargement of the BRICS or of the role of the BRICS has. And as you said, I'm only a journalist and who has this, I do agree, it's a fantastic opportunity to be at these meetings, to be at these places, to talk to these people and talk to these leaders. And what I witness, Akim, is a sense that actually they have a plan, and that's what I saw in South Africa. They have a plan, they have an objective, and they have money. So the plan, what is the plan? To question the current system and to denounce its bankruptcy. The goal, a reform which would open space for these countries to be also the architects of the international system. And it's a very ambitious objective. They want to be the ones setting the rules of the 21st century. And they say it. So it's not, perhaps that's what they meant. No. That is what they want for the 21st century. Now, what about the money? Yes. Just as a comparison to the G7, for example, the BRICS will have a larger share of the global GDP than the G7 by 2028. That's tomorrow. Actually, it's tonight. By tonight, the BRICS will have a larger share of global GDP than the G7. With the enlargement, for example, it will represent that the BRICS supply 48% of global oil. That's huge. That's huge. So, by the way, they also want a new financial system, actually in response to what Guterres himself claims it's a moral bankrupt global financial system. This sentence is by Guterres himself. So, let's be clear here. This means power. This means a power shift that perhaps we haven't seen for many, many decades. We can get later on that. Obviously, there are huge challenges. I'm not saying this is a destiny. First, knowing some of these emerging countries, they do not have same, let's say, foreign policy objectives, not always. And secondly, there's a deep contradiction of models of society even within these countries. I would not be able to be a journalist of 60% of the BRICS countries, right? So just to conclude, And your question, I think it's absolutely the one that has to be put. Unless global governance, meaning also Geneva, reflects this new reality, it will be difficult to stay relevant. It's not an option, reform or status quo. It is reform or insignificance.
Thank you, Jamil. This is, I think, a very important startup to recognize these power shifts and to not only nudge colleagues and institutions here in Geneva that they are, of course, part of a bigger system that is questioned. You pointed to the actors that want to change the power. And I'm now turning to Marie-Laure, to you, because there are another set of actors in the investment management industry that are also quite powerful. Because as you said, Jamil, there is money. Also in the private industry, there's money, and there is interest also to change on another systemic frontline, which is about ecological collapse and climate change. Marie-Laure, you would like to just enter into your article?
Yeah, I'd love to, and really delighted to be here tonight to hear about all of these interesting ideas that will help us shape a better future, which has to also be a hopeful future. But I loved how you said that there's like a notion of also getting with reality, right? We have to recognize things. And one of the realities that we need to wake up to, especially as one of the largest cross-border wealth managers in the world, which we are in Geneva, is that markets are a social construct, but the biophysical realities upon which human societies and human beings depend are not. And until now, markets and the economy have lived in blessed isolation, I would say financial markets probably even more, from this reality that environmental and social externalities have not actually been priced in. So it's great to talk about GDP, but actually GDP does not necessarily reflect the costs associated to creating that financial wealth. And today, this is increasingly coming back into portfolios that we are managing on behalf of clients here, but in other financial centers, in the form of inflated input prices that will only get worse with geopolitical conflict, in the form of regulation, litigation, places that are becoming virtually uninsurable. And so this is something where we have a great responsibility to act, but a great risk if we do not. But besides this reality, right, which is shifting and causing also this need to realign financial systems with this biophysical reality, there's also the notion that actually as financial institutions, we have an enormous role to play. To your point, there is capital. But it's, right now, capital is called where there is already capital. Right, 80% of the capital is actually owned in OECD countries. It's not going where it needs to go. So financial institutions can actually play a huge role in reducing those risks I was mentioning before. We can direct capital towards the solutions that are going to displace fossil fuels, because today there are not necessarily enough solutions out there that are going to move us towards a more circular world. We can also invest in the players that are transitioning, because 90% of this is a shift from brown to green. It's not just fossil fuel that needs to change. We need to change the way we create everything because we're so dependent on an energy system that needs to shift, but also on being very wasteful, right? We waste a lot. And I think this is probably the 21st century will be known for as a century of waste if we survive this, and I believe we will. The third piece we can do besides investing in solutions and investing in the transition is engage for change. Engage with the companies in which we invest in collaboration with other investors, because we can't do it alone. Often we're a very small portion of global capital pools. We have to engage with the clients that have entrusted their money to us in order to create the products and solutions that allow them to shift their capital where it's needed most and where the returns will come in the future because of demographic shifts, because of what we've heard before. And Geneva is in a unique position to do this, because this cannot be done by one single industry, or one single sector, or just the public sector, or just the private sector. This is something that we need to do together. And Geneva has been a place that where ideas and open dialogue have coexisted for centuries. It is home to the wealth we mentioned before, to an enormous amount of international organizations, to NGOs, to country missions, the highest proportion of foundations per capita anywhere in the world. And so this is a place where if we are to find the solutions of the future, to build the bridges between these different areas, to be able to not just finance change, but probably also change finance, this is probably the place where we can do it. So that's a little bit where I'd go with this.
Thank you very much. And I want to just have one small little follow-up. In your article, you mentioned the Climate Action 100+ Alliance. And you mentioned this is a conglomeration of 68 trillion in assets. I really checked this because I wanted to make sure I have the right figure when we publish this. To engage the world's 170 largest greenhouse gas emitters. Can you just unpack this a little bit? This is a very big number.
Oh, I'm so glad you asked me about this. And I'm so glad you asked me about this because polarization right now in this segment is so important. So coming back, so yes, 68 trillion, what does that represent? It represents the total capital of the firms that have committed to engage with the companies in which they invest to set targets, transition plans, if you will, aligned with net zero by 2050, to be much more open and transparent about the data that they have around this, so to actually understand their own footprint. A lot of companies don't even know the difference between scope 1, 2, and 3. So there's enormous amounts of education to do as well there. And so it's a coalition that was created in 2015 in the wake of the Paris Agreement, because if you look at most investors, even a company like Pictet, we tend to be a very small portion of the ownership of a shareholder, as a shareholder of the companies in which we invest. And so the theory behind Climate Action 100 was that if investors banded together, they would actually have much more power and not be just 0.5% of the overall capital, but become 10, 15, 20%. The reason this question is so important is that over the last couple of months, because of the polarization around the question of ESG in the US, you have the JP Morgan Asset Management, some of the larger players in the United States that have actually pulled out. What you're seeing is some of the players pulling out with their US entities, but staying in with their European entities, because they know that in Europe, it's actually important for the institutional investors. So they're pulling out in the US, but they're with the US entity, but not in Europe. And this is the moment where we need to reaffirm that the commitment to collaborating on these issues, to banding together, that we're stronger when we approach this also in a more targeted way, so a company doesn't get 1,000 different investor letters asking for 50 different things, but a clear set of asks that we all align on. And there's not just the Climate Action 100, there's nature action, there's water action. Mm-hmm. There are a number of dimensions upon which we can engage today together. But again, this polarization, we see it also. And it's the time to lean in, to bring, as Marie-Laure said, to have this hope that we can actually show a different way and hang on and continue the collaboration and continue to work also in Asia, so not just in Europe, and in other parts of the world. Right, so I'm glad you asked that question.
Absolutely, just the figures on that scale, one has to be really correct. But what you're already pointing to, and what you, Jamil, have pointed out, what you, Marie-Laure, have mentioned, that if we see a new type of actors coming out of the BRICS that are still states, that are shaping change in global politics, we have here another set of actors coming out that have a role in their own right, which also tells that diplomacy is changing and the way activism is being done is changing. And this also leads us, of course, to other very powerful sector in the world, which is the tech sector and the role of artificial intelligence that many actors want to structure governance arrangements around. And this is what you have written about in the Geneva Policy Outlook, Roxana.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have here the tech industry leading all the efforts around. Okay. Can you hear me now? Excellent. Absolutely, we have here a new set of actors, primarily the big tech companies on both the US and the Chinese side that are leading these developments. So we're seeing a great divide between what the public sector can offer in terms of governance mechanisms and regulation efforts and what the industry is providing at the moment, which is much, much faster than anything we have seen before. So all the innovation that comes from private research labs is actually deployed immediately. All of us have heard about ChatGPT and so on. We are all probably using some of these tools as we speak. Many of them have been integrated even without our knowledge in digital technologies that are on our devices, but then we're actually leaving out the question of governing adequately. Sure, we are asking this question, but we're not necessarily doing as much about it as we could have or as we should have. So in my contribution, I start by distinguishing between the general purpose technology, which is what we have all around, and AI is now built on top of the internet, so it is deployed as a mainstream technology. And the hype around AI, which is the general artificial intelligence in the sense of a super intelligence, some sort of superpower that is going to compete with human brains. Well, we're not yet there, but that has shaped very much the discourse around AI. We're always talking about the risks, about those super robots that will come and replace us, but we're not yet there. In fact, what we're seeing is a version of AI that is much more mundane, where you have generative AI, for example, performing some tasks with various levels of success, but performing those tasks as a form of aid to human needs rather than as replacing the humans. But of course, we need to consider the whole plethora of risks and complexities when it comes to how we govern this space, and it's fair to also ask the question of how the military AI will look like in a couple of years, right? We don't really know the answer to that. But as we think about governing this space, there are three important undercurrents that are shaping it at the moment. And the first one is related to what Jamil was just saying. It's geopolitics. I mean, it's in everything. Obviously, we're seeing those power shifts also playing out in technology. And where you buy technology from is actually one of the questions that you need to sort out before you do anything else. Are you buying from the Americans? Are you buying from the Chinese? It's basically a choice between the two, with Europe playing some role, but mostly on the regulatory side. It's more about infrastructure, and that's produced in one of those two poles. Then there's a question of how we rein in the big tech. We've seen already the effects with platform governance, for example, with other spaces that used to be public but now have become entirely private, and we've seen the effects there. If you come in too late with regulation, it might simply be too late to control the effects of that space. And of course, we're talking about elections this year, right? More than half of the globe will vote this year. So disinformation, misinformation, deep fakes, everything you want to put in that category links back to the power of these AI tools that are growing in their influence. And thirdly, there is fragmentation. There's no alignment on what policies should be followed regionally or globally. So this fragmentation also plays out in how we shape governance in this space. So if we turn now to the role of Geneva, I think there are two important anchors that we should leverage. The first one is international law and humanitarian protections that were born out of Geneva and continue to play an important role. There's huge deployment of AI in humanitarian action, and that is completely uncontrolled. And until we figure out where and how this should be contained or safeguarded, we are in a pretty bad position. And secondly, there's the anchor of standardization. A lot of the important standard-setting organizations are headquartered in Geneva and continue to play a key role in designing those technical standards. They are invisible to the users, but they maintain our networks interoperable. So that's the other key power that I see coming out of Geneva. But I think it's also worth thinking about how we can all contribute beyond these pockets of important power in Geneva. I think one of the contributions is around developing that common vocabulary or terminology related to AI and to AI governance in particular. We're still speaking different languages. If you go to a tech meeting, you're going to hear completely different terminology than if you go to a UN negotiation. It has always been the case to a certain extent, but I think with technology we really need to come closer and have those understandings shared across different communities. Second, we can also think about what's beyond AI. It's not always that the attention has to be placed on AI. We also have to think about the non-digital equivalents and actually set in place adequate protections for those non-digital parts of humanity. And that's really key, especially when we talk about this new wave of AI potentially replacing us. And thirdly, I think it's really useful to harness the value of inclusivity and equal participation that Geneva has actually fostered much more than any of the other global hubs for global governance. We have seen this in Geneva, and we're seeing again that NGOs are much more involved in Geneva as compared to New York or Vienna or even other places. We can now add Beijing to this because we're going to talk about technology being in this poles of power. So really fostering that inclusive spirit of Geneva and bringing into the conversation both academia and evidence from research, but also NGOs, the technical community, and everybody who can participate.
Thank you. Now, I want to go back to the title. How will Geneva remain relevant? And what you've already said is that we have to work with what's here and make use of it. Utilize the multi-sectorial and the technical diversity which is out here in this time, and make the connections, translate between the constituencies because they speak different language. But I'm not satisfied. I want to know more. Why should Geneva remain relevant? Just very briefly, I'd like to ask all three of you, what is the Geneva that has to be out there? Not in Geneva itself, but how has Geneva needs to be in your dealing with the systemic issues that you, from power shifts to climate change and to AI. How does Geneva has to be elsewhere to be relevant? We start from you, Roxana, back.
I think Geneva simply needs to speak with a stronger voice. There is already some work on AI in Geneva, and it's fair to say that it has actually been one of the pioneers with AI for Good conference and some of the other activities here, but the discussions are moving elsewhere. So I guess unless we are able to come together, harmonize a little bit the internal divergences in Geneva and put forward that contribution of Geneva, we're not going to be as influential on a global level as we would want it to be. And I think the risk here is really a big one, because we are going to lose out on that inclusivity. We're moving to club formats. It's the G7, it's the BRICS. It's not all of us together. It's not all of humanity. It's not priority given to peace, security. So I think we really have to leverage the power of Geneva and make it part of this conversation. Otherwise, we're in for a relatively pessimistic future.
Marcelo, you want to comment on this?
No, yeah, I would absolutely agree that I think using our voice more, and especially in the areas that are existential. And I think, well, finance obviously is the area I know, but it is a very important part and has been for many years of our economy. And making use of what we have, I think the social side, right? Even if you look at the question around the transition, right? And I think I say this as well in the article, the speed and scale of the forthcoming energy transition will be determined by the social foundations, whether or not they're in place. Are people on board? Are human beings considered in this conversation? Are their livelihoods, their rights? So the whole conversation around human rights, around all of these things, which Geneva has something to say about, needs to also be brought to the fore in the financial debate. 10 years ago, when you talked about climate change to most financial institutions, 10, 15 years ago, they would tell you, this is not for us, this is a political question. Today, they're saying very similar things about social questions. We can accelerate that arc, given our knowledge, right, and bring that to the fore and be vocal. So I think I think bringing more out there is key.
Thank you. I mean,
very briefly, I think the world will need still a place where these blocks or this power shifting elements will have to establish dialogue. It can be a place, but it will not be naturally a place. It will have to be worked. It will have to be pitched. It will not be naturally the hub for BRICS and the G7 or whatever you want to call it. To be honest, yesterday was a very, very strange day in Geneva, for example. Guterres at the disarmament conference was saying, you have failed. Hours before that, in the Human Rights Council, he said, the Security Council has failed. And actually, the Human Rights Council, people were looking at each other and said, what about us? Huh? I don't want to get into conclusions here, but you can imagine. What I'm saying is that unless you recognize that these structures, they need deep reforms, this hub, this place of dialogue, will not be naturally the place for future dialogue.
But then at least the history and the notion, the spirit of dialogue, that is something that you can infuse to put Geneva in elsewhere, into the discussions, even if we don't. So if you can't have them here, put Geneva inside elsewhere, in a way. Thank you so much. There will be plenty of opportunities to react, to engage with further questions and observations as we go on. May I just ask now Andrew, Suri, and Paula on stage, and perhaps already an applause for our first authors. Thank you. Now, if in the first in this first section we focused on the more larger systemic issues, on geopolitical shifts, on climate change and II, we now want to come a little bit closer to home and review a little bit of what's going on in town. What are the negotiations? What's been happening in some of the two big footprint issues on health and human rights here, and also what is happening with new actors, what is in diplomacy, such as cities. So, Suri, let's start with you. Pandemics has been a very big topic in Geneva, and there has been a tremendous timeline that has been set for the negotiations on the pandemics. You have followed the negotiations very intensely. You have written also in the last Geneva Policy Outlook. What is new this year?
Thanks very much. Thank you very much for the invitation, and congratulations to the whole GPO team. I think it's a fantastic issue, and really looking forward to such a wide-ranging discussion this evening. Indeed, as we sit here, the parties are negotiating just up the hill at the WHO towards a pandemic accord, which is hoped to be I think, very much a necessary, but first new international rules to try to govern the global prevention and response to pandemics well, depending on how you count, for either a generation or for centuries. And after a crisis of the magnitude of COVID-19, it seems normal, it seems natural that we found that the existing rules and institutions that we had failed. They obviously were not good enough to prevent or to control this pandemic. Yes, we need a better set of rules. So it all makes perfect sense. But as somebody was coming to me just before this evening program began, my article is quite pessimistic, and indeed, I remain relatively pessimistic. It's quite possible that we will fail to agree on any new international rules to address pandemics for a range of reasons. And so today we have, I was counting, 12 negotiating days left, with parties still very, very far apart on a wide range of issues, and I go through them in more detail in my article. But just to emphasize, there is a lot of daylight between parties still, not just on one issue, but on about 5 issues. There is no agreement on whether this set of rules should be a legally binding treaty or it should be also legally binding regulation, which might seem like legalese, but actually has some quite important implications. And there's also no agreement on the process. How are we actually going to get across the finish line in 12 negotiating days? And so overall, I think it is indeed very, it's a big hill to climb. And at the same time, one of my causes for optimism is everybody agrees because of the elections coming down the pipeline, because everyone seems to have forgotten, actually, that pandemics are a life-changing crisis for everybody, for every individual, for economy, for society, for education, not just a health crisis. There is, I think, a renewed kind of push. We have to finish by May. So that is really my source of optimism, but how we will finish by May, if we will finish by May, and what does it mean? What do those new rules look like? Will they actually deliver on even half of the ambitions that we started with a few years ago, is a very open question at this point.
But Suri, one follow-up question. In terms of multilateral negotiations, if you don't finish by May, but you finish in 2026, it's still pretty quick for a multilateral negotiation, because these take very long. And what's the balance between being quick and relatively short? And perhaps incomplete, or taking 2 years more to negotiate longer?
I think in principle, yes, we could take a couple more years. I think when people look out at the state of the world and the polycrisis that we are in, as well as the very short memories, and you know, it's hard to mobilize even a fraction of the public investment we need to prevent pandemics. You would think, okay, we had maybe $9 trillion of economic losses linked to COVID-19. We're asking for maybe 10 billion a year to invest in health systems to detect and prevent future pandemics. We've raised maybe 1 billion, depending on how you count. So I throw out these numbers just to emphasize that we have forgotten very quickly the urgency. And so the idea that we could drag these negotiations on for 2 more years, will we get to something better? I think for many of the negotiators I've spoken to, they say, we don't see it. And of course, depending on the way certain elections may go, we might have certain countries completely abandoning the negotiations. And so there is a very strong urge to, let's get this done now, let's get the best possible deal we can. And then, of course, many of the details can be worked out in future conference of the parties and protocols and that sort of thing. So I agree that the time to push is now, and yet I don't see a clear path to get there.
But then what you have just mentioned is perhaps an answer to how will multilateralism remain relevant, because it's a very good deal. If you have good rules, you can prevent significant economic losses. 10 billion help you save a lot of money. That's a pretty good pitch for fundraising usually. If we could mobilize to show that multilateralism is really important and can help save losses?
I think in some ways, I would argue multilateralism and the negotiation of rules, common rules binding all countries, whether we're talking about BRICS or the global north or the global south, you know, everyone in between. I think those rules are actually more important than the money. And what is shifting more broadly in global health, and I think this has very important implications for Geneva, is that global health used to be primarily about development aid, flowing through big institutions in Geneva and elsewhere, to the tune of about $40 billion per year until recently. The interesting shift that has happened is that money is flatlining, and is probably actually going to decrease, in part because of the rise of BRICS and other countries that we were just hearing about, in part because of the rise of crises. So you had, I think for the first time, humanitarian aid spending from the major ODA funders has eclipsed, it's actually higher than development assistance for health, I think for the first time in either 22 or 23, quite recently. But I flag this because I think we are undergoing some profound transitions in Geneva, at least in the health sector, where the rulemaking and the governance processes more broadly become increasingly important, and the money is less important. And so to me, the question is not, can we raise 10 billion in Geneva for pandemic preparedness? Because that has never come from Geneva anyways. The question is, can you negotiate rules so that countries collectively raise the billions needed to invest in their own health system, so that we collectively prevent and detect and stop outbreaks before they become pandemics. But, as I said, I'm not sure we'll get there.
Which still reminds us, what you say is that rulemaking and rules are still at the heart of multilateralism. And this is my gateway to you, Andrew. No, because if there is a well-recognized body of rules, it's about the Geneva Conventions, the rules of war. This is what Geneva is known for, and it's this manifestation of rule-based multilateralism. But you write a piece on human rights and war. So help us, walk us through what is your thought about activating, in fact, human rights law in times of war?
Indeed, I wanted to stress the fact that indeed we have international humanitarian law and the laws of war and the Geneva Conventions, and there are people from the high-up officials from the International Committee of the Red Cross in the room, and all of that is important, but it does eclipse human rights law a bit, and I wanted to bring human rights back into the picture. I mean, Geneva is the hub for international humanitarian law. We have the International Committee of the Red Cross, but we also have the Human Rights Council, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, multiple civil society organizations. And I think that the wars that we're witnessing at the moment deserve some thinking about human rights and not just the application of the laws of war. So the particular thing that triggered me, if you like, was reading Hugo Slim in a previous edition of the Geneva Policy Outlook saying, we're now heading for economic warfare, where there are sanctions being used which are causing huge effects on people. And the only way to resolve this is not through the laws of war, but with human rights. The right to food, the right to water, the right to health, all of these are affected. But I actually wanted to go a bit further and challenge some fundamental thinking about war, because we're witnessing not only sanctions, but blockade and siege. Now, for me, those are very old-fashioned ideas that belong in the 19th century. The idea that you can siege people into starvation so they surrender is an old idea, but we shouldn't be accepting it today. You can say, no, you must do your siege in accordance with the laws of war, but I'm saying that's the wrong starting point. We shouldn't have siege at all. We shouldn't have blockade. We don't have slavery. We don't say you can have a way of doing slavery. We've abolished it, but let's see how we can make it better. No, we should have no siege and no blockade. And a human rights law approach starts to help you to think about that and conceive it, because we don't accept that you can torture your prisoners of war. So why should you be able to starve the military on the other side into submission? It doesn't make sense to me in the 21st century. So I wanted to sort of give a bit of a resurgence to human rights law and challenge some of the sort of default thinking, which is all of this can be resolved through the application of the Geneva Conventions. I love the Geneva Conventions. I want them to be respected, but they don't always help you if you're interested in the victims of war. I'll give you one example. The attacks on hospitals or the attacks on schools. An international humanitarian law approach says you have to work out what was the military advantage, and then we have to see if the civilian casualties were excessive in relation to what that perceived military advantage was. By the time you've explained that to somebody, you've basically lost your audience and you've lost the chance to change something. If you rephrase it as a question of the right to health, destroying a hospital has destroyed the right to health. You have violated the right to health, not just of the people who are trying to get treated, but all the people who are on their way to the hospital, all the generations that won't get access to healthcare in the immediate future. And taking a targeting, immediate question, was this a war crime, to hit it on the day, may be important, but I think we should be reflecting in human rights terms. And so that was what I wanted to raise. Now, we could get on to, which fora and how do you do that in Geneva. One thing I'll say before you ask the follow-up question is, we could have states parties meetings of the Geneva Conventions here in Geneva to discuss this current crisis. Unfortunately, states, I'm sure there are some states in the room, but for some reason states are not calling for that. But normally states will call for a states parties meeting of the Geneva Conventions. We could have states parties meetings for the human rights treaties to discuss these things. We can galvanize the Human Rights Council to get more active and be more relevant than the Security Council. So I think there's plenty for Geneva to be doing, but I decided to focus less on the institutions and more on the ideas in the piece. And I'm sorry for that if it's a bit abstract.
No, but what you emphasize to the best possible way, the argument we heard already before, to really use the instruments and the entities and the systems which are already in place. On the one hand, we heard from Jamil that systems are perceived to be failing, but then there are systems. So your recommendations go really into the direction, well, let's use it, let's use the system. And to press you a little bit more, practically, how do you activate this then? How do you activate this, the human rights machinery at this point in time? Do you go on a specific case? Do you, what do you do tomorrow morning after the session?
I mean, I'll march up to the Human Rights Council and demand a special session and galvanize states to ensure that that happens. No, I mean, there are all of these possibilities, but I suppose I'll come back to my theme. It's really about changing people's attitude to war. Instead of thinking, it's a war, civilians will get killed, innocents will die, quoting President Joe Biden, we should be thinking about the right of the people not to be killed, the right of people to have access to hospitals and schools, and changing the way targeting decisions are done. But I suppose going back to the director's sort of introductory remarks, it's more about the esprit de Genève, the spirit of Geneva, the âme of Geneva, than necessarily triggering this particular mechanism or not. I mean, there are hundreds of different possibilities within the Human Rights Council. You know, there are multiple special rapporteurs. But I'm saying let's convene meetings where we think the hard thoughts about how to change the default position.
Yeah. And that is exactly the traveling against the zeitgeist, which I think defines this esprit de Genève. Thank you very much, Andrew. Now, we want to come to one other facet of work in Geneva, which is, and we have already alluded to this, the role of so many different actors in diplomacy that are not states. And Paula, you have worked for many, many years now on the role of cities in diplomacy, among other things by hosting for many years the Forum of Mayors in Geneva, in your role at UNEC. Just explain us a little bit how this voice of cities, this kind of other diplomatic actor, and of course cities are the place where most people live today. How do you see this being strengthened in Geneva, and what happens in Geneva can be relevant for cities?
Well, thank you, Akim, for actually including cities in this discussion, because it's very important, and I see it very relevant for whatever discussion we are having, whether it's human rights, pandemics, or cities have been at the center of many of these crises, and they still are. What I think it's important to underline about my article, that my article was focused on something we have done, because there is a lot about we could do this, right? And it would be nice to do this, and hypothetically. And I wanted to stress this has happened, and this has happened in Geneva through UNEC. We have been talking in UNEC for 75 years about cities, because we have a committee that's called Committee on Urban Development, Housing and Land Management. So obviously we talked about cities. So one thing is to talk about cities and analyze the problems of cities, whatever angle you want to give it. Another thing is to have cities participating in the work of the UN. And this was really the goal that we had in mind, and actually the challenge. Because as you know, cities are participating in meetings of the UN as observers or a civil society, or as part of a national delegation. But we wanted to give a voice to cities in something that is called United Nations. So already there, right, there is a little bit of a problem. How do we give them participation, what I call in the article de jure? So how we give them really a sort of identity within the process. And this has been really the discussion, very much procedural, very much related to rules, and related to the terms of reference of a group, but we made it happen. And what we have seen that is very fruitful, because we thought of inviting mayors to talk about very limited topics, right? With urban development, okay, let's talk about urban planning, how do we manage a city, and they came and they really wanted to go in all directions. And here I'm coming to the role of Geneva. They really wanted to interact not only with UNEC and what we do with urban planning, but hey, this is the UN, this is Geneva, there is WHO, there is human rights, there is UNCTAD, and what can we do within these other organizations and groups? And the idea really here is to study, and for Geneva itself, how do we bridge this forum beyond UNEC so that mayors can really interact act on many other topics and areas. And I think that last year we had some conversations on the side, for instance, on the pandemic, and the head of WHO came and discussed with a group of mayors on what could happen for city, and how city can really help also with pandemics, how they've reacted. They were in the forefront of the battle after all, and many cities found themselves really unprepared to that challenge. So how can cities also adapt, but also how can they exchange experiences? And one of the main outputs, I would say, and outcomes of the forum is really the exchange of experience. And we said it many times, right? We are a platform to exchange it, but they do it because it's mayors that meet other mayors that otherwise they would never meet, from the region and beyond. And what I think is also interesting, we have created an interregional segment, so we go beyond the boundaries of UNICE. And this year we realized that interregional segment was too small, so we are simply opening the whole forum also to mayors outside of the UNICE region. And this exchange is very fruitful because we go also beyond the stories of relatively rich cities that we can have in the UNICE region to cities all around the world. So that's a bit the outcome.
What I take out of this in terms of the relevance for Geneva is that we should not forget that others who are in very specific niches or very far away, they still find relevance in the docking station. Because there are which is Geneva, there are very few places where you have such a degree of cross-cutting knowledge available with in one go. And just perhaps share a little bit your thoughts now. If you have said we have established this and it's there, yes. What about the future? How do you keep the role of cities relevant for Geneva?
There was one comment I wanted to make also, yes. For what I heard before, like what should Geneva do, right? And the only thing that was coming to my mind was investments and money. Because we heard a lot of things will be nice to do, but if you don't invest, if you don't put money, you're not going to enlarge the visibility and power of Geneva in so many areas. Yes, you can be a hub, so you can bring people here. So certainly we'll attract more and more mayors, hopefully, that hopefully will interact with many more organizations, ideally. But this requires money and investment also to make sure that the hub is structured in a way that is more attractive, more efficient, more useful. And also, the other point that was discussed before, how do we go out and explain what's happening in Geneva? And that also requires investment. Who is going to do this? How we're going to do that? So I would say that not that money is the solution to everything, but when it comes also to a system which is in a crisis also, a financial crisis itself, and the UN is under pressure from that perspective, maybe we should really identify extra funding to be invested in the enlargement of this role for Geneva. If that is probably for the Geneva Authority to decide, but if I were them, I will definitely invest in being more attractive. In our case, definitely to cities, because there also you have an audience which is much larger than member states, right, potentially. And the other day I was actually doing one of these games with ChatGPT to understand what I can do with ChatGPT for work and what I cannot do. And I was asking questions about how many cities have more than 10 million inhabitants in the world. And there are many. How many cities have more than 1 million inhabitants? And there are even more. And we are talking about cities that are bigger than countries. So, right? So their economic relevance, their financial relevance, their social relevance is higher than certain countries. So definitely they have to be integrated in the conversation. Maybe not on an equal footing, that's a different story. Because again, we are talking about in United Nations, but certainly fully included in the system as actors.
And what you say is, if Geneva has this branding of being the center where you do, in fact, human-centered work, be that through human rights, focus on health, or otherwise, then you cannot go around of cities, because that's where most of humanity lives. So I think that's a very important point. I already know that we're going to go a little bit over time, so do just to take 15 minutes more. Is there anything that you still want to share on how will Geneva remain relevant? You had the two fingers.
Thanks. I had a two-finger because I agree very much with the point that Paolo made, that we have to invest in communicating to the world what happens in Geneva. But I think even more than that, even beyond the demystifying, we have to help equip people to engage in the governance processes happening here. And I think part of that is, it's information, it's knowledge. When we run some of our webinars, we sometimes get many, many more participants around the world because they're curious about what's happening here than we do, the locals, let's say. So I think that thirst and that interest is there. But what we also have is an extremely uneven playing field, and we know this. And that uneven playing field is very, very slow to become less uneven. And I don't think we're actually going to get to an even playing field. But in health, we have a field where we are transitioning from a donor-recipient logic that has been there for several decades at least, to a equal parties negotiating logic. But in order to get there and to try to ensure that parties are somewhere even close to equal, to be able to negotiate and to agree on a final set of rules, not just for pandemics, but more generally, agree on a set of rules that really reflect the interests of a broad range of countries, that really enjoy political legitimacy, not just among diplomats, but also at home. That requires skilled diplomacy, and not just of the formal kind. And I think there's some really interesting thinking that you guys have highlighted here in GPO around, what does that diplomacy need to look like? But I think the investment in making that playing field a little bit less uneven, to equip people to engage and influence the processes here, which is also about providing training for people. I think that is one of the areas where investment is really necessary.
And if you want to learn how to do skilled diplomacy, sign up for the Graduate Institute Executive Education. Skilled diplomacy right there. Thank you so much. Now, I would, a round of applause for you. What we would like to do now is, of course, for any audience in Geneva, you know that there are at least more than half of the individuals in the audience who could also be panelists. And this is exactly an audience like this. I already want to just flag, we have a couple more authors who are in the room. There's Mark Zaytoun, who's right there. We have Fred Tanner, who's also here. Who else did I miss? There's another author. Other author anywhere? No? And what is now a fun... Oh, yes, hi. You're also another author. What I would like to do now is to open the floor, but not necessarily as a Q&A, but as a moment for reflection. And my value added is that I can just offer you a reflection for a commentary to one of the authors, now, if it is related to an issue area. So the lady had the hand up. There's a microphone in the back. I have you also. Let's start with you.
Good evening. Excuse me, but I'm going to freak out. If I see more of these panels with basically mostly white people, I'm just going to... This is how you remain relevant. Look at what South Africa has done at the World Court. Probably, I don't know if anybody expected South Africa to do that, but they have achieved an amazing feat. And this goes to the Geneva Graduate Institute, all of the institutions of Geneva. Be more inclusive, or, let me put it in a negative sense, stop being so white.
And I'm very pleased to share that, of course, as part of the Geneva Policy Outlook, we do have a standing annual meeting with African ambassadors and African professors here. So we cannot put everything on stage tonight, but we are very sensitive to this point. Because as soon as you start changing the composition of the table, of who's around the table, the conversation changes. And we are very aware of that. So thank you very much for raising this point. We had a question up there. Thank you.
I would like to answer, actually it's not a question, it's an answer to the question that is posed. How will Geneva remain relevant? I believe it is by housing a new governance process, which is called the Resilience to Robustness Equilibrium. And it is championed by the One Goal Initiative for Governance. Now, this is also what the G7, but also the BRICS could base themselves on, which means that how will Geneva then be elsewhere? It will be everywhere if this process is done. This process has a computational and a deliberative side. So the deliberative side could be here. Computational side could be everywhere for security reasons. So this is my
Thank you so much. We have an additional comment observation here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Agi Veres, and I work with UNDP. My reflection is that actually all of these issues, what comes out very strongly is in the interconnectedness of these issues. And I think that's also the value of the Geneva Policy Outlook, and goes back to your question of how will Geneva remain relevant. Because I think what we struggle with, whatever organization we work with, or the member states, or whoever is part of these discussions, is the silos that exist in these areas. I mean, you talked about the pandemic treaty. It's the health organizations that are in there, of course, led with it's the member states, and the process is, of course, led with those consultations. Then you have the peace bubble that is all about the peace element. Then you have the humanitarians, that it's all about the humanitarian and human rights, and we can go on. So I think what is good about this process, and maybe where the role of Geneva could be strengthened, is to bring these together, break the silos, and really promote the interconnectedness of these issues. Because we will not resolve any of that, I mean, if that's the ambition, without looking at them as a system, as a complexity, and as the challenge that because of the connections is where we are stuck, for example, on some of these issues.
And I will add the layer of intergenerational, because we are here at a university. We have 60% of our students are non-European. And this is where we are really at the hotbed, not just of the views from the European young generation, but the global young generation. And that's, I think, also a very important cross-cutting element which we have to leverage into this. I mean, if we spoke about the future without young people, that's kind of less relevant, which we do. Which brings me to invite any student who's here to, of course, also join the conversation. Yes, please.
Catherine Rice, not a student, representing the Health Diplomacy Alliance. And it's really good to see the perspective of each of the actors of what you have presented here. And what we see is a little bit of what is happening, but how we found the answers. And I think we have to ask ourselves what is missing in Geneva. So I think it will be two things. We have the structure, the governance structure there, but it's a structure that needs a reform. So how Geneva positions itself to reform this structure that is already there and take advantage of this. And there are two things that I hope somebody from the government, either of Switzerland or Geneva, is here. There is the financial issue that has been mentioned, the inclusion of civil society, and the speed. We have to be at the speed of the changing. Diplomacy is not in decline. Diplomacy is changing, and we have to adapt to what it is. And I think this is what is missing in Geneva: the speed of change. We need to push what is happening all over the place. Otherwise, Geneva will not continue to be relevant. Thank you.
We do have the representatives in the room, but I will not point them out. But what you mentioned also links me back to the question that I think in the article of Jamil Shad you ask. Are the Geneva institutions ready for the different voices which are out there? If there is really the shift of government or the shift of power in so many places, are the institutions ready to absorb that new collection of voices? Question mark. You didn't answer it, but we'll the next edition. No? Any other reflections? Hans, yes, please. Thank you. The microphone is just coming up.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Hans Born. working for the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance. And I'm a little bit pessimistic about the future of the place of Geneva or multilateralism at large. And I think one of the biggest concerns that quite a few people have pointed out here in the Swiss press, but also in the UK and in Switzerland, is that we have the danger of sleepwalking into the next war, World War III. So I don't want to be drumming on the drum to be too pessimistic, but this whole issue of that we have now quite a few hotspots in the world with outright war, and what can be the contribution of Geneva to address these grim prospects, that we are not sleepwalking into war, and that we maybe focus more on the prevention of war, on the prevention of conflict. And this would be maybe also one of the issues that we could contribute to, at least I hope. So that is, and I think like we should also, how can Geneva remain relevant is not a solution as such of the problem. We should address the most pressing problems, and how then Geneva can input into that. And I think if I talk with many other people, it's this whole prospect that we go into a wrong direction, and that people, that states don't respect anymore the multilateral system and with invasion. So how can we counter that, and how can we really sincerely contribute to the prevention of war? That's it. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have one question to you. Now, I want to have a few. Who is longer in Geneva than 20 years of you? Okay. Who's longer than 10 years here? Now, can I just ask, who has just arrived? Who's here for the last 6 months? Can I ask you who've just arrived, what do you make of this discussion you just heard? I know Bernard Keo sits here. We had another hand up there, another hand over there. I would be very curious, because if you live too long in Geneva, you know, international Geneva becomes part of your bloodstream. Do you have any reflections of those who just came to Geneva? Can you just, who wants to reflect on? Yes, please. Just, the microphone is coming. Just the lady up here.
So I am a student in the Institute, and honestly, I came here to Geneva because I was expecting to like future prospects. You make the connections, you study, you get this multiple perspectives, and you stay connected to the hub where everything kind of happens. And now in the classes also here, you hear a lot of questions like, oh, what is happening to multilateralism? The UN, which is here in Geneva, what is the future? So also now listening to the perspectives, I'm questioning like, oh, did I arrive too late now, or what is happening? So it's kind of scary, but also there were like some positive outlooks in there, but yeah, I'm reflecting a lot. So I think this is from a student perspective, yeah.
Thank you very much. Anyone else who just pass the microphone up here.
My name is Alper Yüksel. I'm a Turkish nationality. I have lived in Geneva 17 years back. I was part of the Procter & Gamble group. I'm now, and I traveled afterwards 7 countries. Lived in United Arab Emirates in the last 8 years, 2 years in Saudi Arabia. And then because we loved Geneva 15 years back, we came back to Geneva. I'm the CEO of a creative digital agency at the moment. So my impression is not much has changed versus 17 years ago. And having lived in those countries where Jamil has mentioned a little bit, in the BRICS countries, emerging world has been very dynamic. And digitalization is there. There is a very young population demographic in the emerging world, and I think Geneva has to embrace that more, and also has to embrace the outsiders more. That's the feeling also I do have. Of course, with the very positives, and our dream was to come back to Geneva. It also offers a lot of balance and stability. That is the great thing. So how will Geneva remain relevant? It's actually an island of stability and trust that could be reflected to the world from here. Again, having come back after 20 years, living here for the last 1 year, and having seen the world a little bit, in the emerging part.
Thank you so much for this reflection. There was just behind you, there was one last comment, and then we'll briefly wrap up.
Thanks. I'm Jessica, and I've just really recently, in the last couple of years, moved in from London, but also lived globally. And I think for me, Roxana's comment about we're moving to a club format was an interesting one, because that's personally what I wrote my thesis on, as finance or trade and climate change, just the cross-sector dynamic ability to work together and navigate the obstacles. And what I'm looking to Geneva for, or questioning whether it has it, is it dynamic enough? Like, can it be dynamic? Because multilateralism, to an extent, has maybe stagnated, and now maybe with the club formation, that's how we're looking at BRICS. They've moved forward there. They've almost been a club. Well, it is a club format, and can that be the approach? But has Geneva got the ability to do that?
Thank you so much. And what we came, what we came up with also when we as a team, at the end of this entire process of a year of reflections and with all these wonderful articles in front of us, we came back with more questions. And this is why we concluded this year's Geneva Policy Outlook with a series, with an article of questions, which is a very refreshing piece to write, because you just offer the questions, you don't have to do the answers. But the challenge was to at least have each question is essentially worth a master's dissertation at the Graduate Institute. And we thought also for this evening, we conclude with a question, and I'd like to invite Lena Menge up here, the other heart behind the Geneva Policy Outlook. Now, one heart for Geneva is not enough, you need at least two. And Lena, over to you for the concluding remarks. Thank you so much.
Concluding with more questions, I don't know if it's the good thing to do, but thank you for all our authors tonight. As presented tonight, the GPO Publications offers a unique introduction to the wealth of issues and negotiations in international Geneva. But at a time when many readers require a guide, sort of handrail for understanding global issues. And as mentioned before, the GPO is also a network of about 150 senior policymakers working within the Geneva global policy spheres, discussing a wide area of questions to explore how international, and I should say, how multilateralism should adapt to remain relevant. I'm not going to say all the questions I have in front of me, but this is the main question that has really led all the discussions of the GPO in the last 2 years. And going into 2024, the GPO will maintain, of course, these guiding questions and tackle other emerging concerns. But with this in mind, we have indeed compiled a quite long list of forward-looking questions that we have for you tonight. And we wanted to put forward some of them, and it really resonates with what we discussed tonight. So who do we listen to? As highlighted by Jamil, International Geneva will need to embrace and deal with an ever-growing diversity of views in the future in order to capitalize even more on its rich ecosystem. And the question we have is, how should different ideas, position, and views be absorbed into formal processes in order to build more accountable multilateral system? And this goes to the questions that the point you raised before. The second line of questioning goes into the direction of how do we speak to each other? In a world full of misinformation, as raised before by Roxana, what are the instruments or spaces required to maintain open dialogues, even in difficult times? How do we translate these dialogues into understanding, trust, and actionable insight? Another key observation from the GPO exchanges we had last year is that our current knowledge of the future should shape our decisions and behaviors today. So we need to adopt an anticipatory approach and should therefore shift the question from what is the future of the current global governance system to what is the global governance for the future. The 2024 edition also highlights the can-do attitude, and it's been mentioned tonight in Geneva policy circles. And some concrete examples have been presented, for instance, with Paola Deda on the pioneering initiative of the Forum of Mayors. So we therefore ask ourselves, what kind of mechanism, coalitions, ways of working are necessary to speed and scale up solutions? And finally, the remaining question is who will pay for multilateralism? In line of rising military expenses and pivotal or critical elections through the year, a sense of uncertainty hangs over international organizations in Geneva. So should states remain the sole funders of multilateralism? How could foundation or private capital contribute for paying for a multilateralism for the future? And Marie-Laure addressed some of the points as well. So so these are the questions that we have asked ourselves within our GPO group, and so I invite you to read more of them in our article. But as underlined in Marie-Laure's article in the GPO last year, our age of radical uncertainty makes courage imperative. And so operationalizing courage should mean to be ready, in her words, for active listening and learning across and beyond all boundaries, and for taking the risk to foster and nurture out-of-the-box ideas and innovative solutions, even under burning daily pressure. So this year, the GPO will continue asking these forward-looking questions. We will also continue nurturing collective reflection, among various sectors on what the global governance of the future should look like. And we will continue encourage courageous transformation and reinvention within international Geneva. So once again, I would like to thank our partners, our GPO community, our GPO authors, and all of you for being present tonight. Please visit our website if you haven't followed Akim's request before, and take one of the printed versions that we have at the entrance if you haven't done so yet. Do not hesitate to contact us for any questions. We're very much looking forward to continuing these necessary exchanges. And on this note, I wish you a good read and a nice evening.
Hello, listeners. I'm Dan Graham, Head of Communications at the Geneva Graduate Institute. As we delve into the complexities of global issues, I'd like to introduce you to another series that offers a deeper dive into key global issues. It's called What Matters Today, and it's produced by the same team that brings you this podcast. In What Matters Today, I, along with guest hosts, ask our faculty to provide their expert commentary on pressing global matters. From dissecting international relations to addressing development challenges, What Matters Today offers scholarly insights that complement our event discussions. If you're eager to broaden your understanding of global affairs and hear from academic experts, I encourage you to give What Matters Today a listen. You can find it on all major podcast platforms. Subscribe now to enrich your perspective beyond our event recordings.
This podcast series is produced by the Geneva Graduate Institute. Follow us on your favorite podcast platform to stay updated on our latest episodes and to keep the conversation going. For more information about the Institute or to join one of our live events, please visit our website at graduateinstitute.ch.